Hi everyone, I'm Katie from Nutritionist Resource and Happiful magazine. Today I'm chatting with award-winning baby and child nutritionist Charlotte Stirling-Reed. So welcome Charlotte, thanks so much for joining me today.
Oh, thank you so much for having me on, I appreciate it.
So today we're going to be chatting about the topic of healthy eating for young children and babies, and Charlotte's going to answer some of our frequently asked questions that we get on Nutritionist Resource as well. But first, Charlotte, I would love it if you could introduce yourself and tell us a little bit more about what led you to a career in nutritional therapy for children.
Okay, so yeah, that's a really great question. I'm Charlotte Stirling-Reed. I'm a baby and child nutritionist. I'm a registered nutritionist, and I did undergraduate and postgraduate degree in nutrition and human biology. And I love it. I love the topic of it. And I think it was always instilled in me from a really young age to have a love for food. I grew up with parents who loved cooking, and my mum was such an advocate of healthy eating. So it's always really come from that, you know. Obviously I had times when I rebelled and I didn't listen to what they recommended, but I loved it. And I also loved science at school. My dad was a science teacher and he really got me into biology, and so when I went to university I genuinely just teamed those two likes, you know, human biology and nutrition. And yeah, that's really where it all came from. And I was really lucky to train with the NHS for 3 years in early child nutrition, and from there on I never really looked back. I did try other roles, but I just love talking about child nutrition because I think it's so important and it can make such a difference. So yeah.
Absolutely, thank you. So yeah, I think let's get into it. So could you explain exactly why healthy eating is so key for babies and young children and how that could set them up for the future?
Oh, absolutely. So there's a huge amount of research now that suggests that, you know, with something called the first 1,000 days, where we know that the moment from conception right up until a child's second birthday seems to have a really important impact on things like development of food preferences, development of eating patterns and behaviors, but also on things like reducing risk of diseases. So reducing risk of a little one developing cardiovascular disease or diabetes later on in life.
Wow.
So it's really fascinating, and there's still research going on, but it does seem to suggest that actually the early years is really important for setting up that kind of, you know, healthy bodies, healthy mind, healthy development in young children. And that's why it's so important. It's not to say that it's not important after that 2 years of age. Of course it still is. Actually, early years can really start to establish patterns of eating and how we eat and how we enjoy food and meal times. And so for me, giving parents confidence with feeding their children is key, because if they are confident in how and what and where to feed their little ones, it can really have a knock-on effect to how their children eat, you know, throughout the rest of their lives, essentially.
Absolutely. So what does it look, we often hear balanced diet is key. So what does that actually look like for babies and young children? How can parents adopt that when they're feeding their babies?
To be honest, it's really similar to that of adults as well. So, you know, we'd still say you want to think about balancing babies' meals out, making sure there's, you know, some carbohydrates and, you know, some whole grains, some not for young babies, because they can't take quite as many whole grains as we might be able to as adults, just because it can bulk out their tummy a little bit. But basically carbohydrates and whole grains, you know, veggies and fruits, proteins and iron-rich foods, and some dairy or alternatives. You ultimately want to do something similar like that for babies and young children, but bearing in mind that obviously they need to have much smaller portion sizes than we have generally. And also bearing in mind that young babies are going to be getting most of their you know, they don't need to worry so much about their dairy and alternatives until they get kind of more like to 1-2 years of age, because most of that's going to come from their usual milk intake. So whether that be breast or formula milk. So ultimately it's basically really similar. So it's balancing meals and, you know, looking at those main food groups to make sure that you're trying to get all of the nutrients in that your little one needs.
Okay, and a common question that we get asked is about refined sugar. So we always think of it as the real bad guy and making young children hyper. So could you talk about perhaps what young sugar does to young children and how parents could maybe watch the refined sugar intake?
So, you know, I try and talk about this from like a really evidence-based perspective. And what we know from a lot of the research is that young children and adults tend to have a high intake of sugar in their diet, so more than what is recommended. And this comes from a variety of sources. So some of it is what we might refer to as refined sugar, so something like table sugar, for example.
Yeah.
But some of it is also coming from sugars that we might not refer to as refined. So things like, you know, the government refer to it as free sugar. And that includes, you know, sugar that we might find in fruit juices. It includes things like honey and maple syrup, and basically anything that is added to our food for sweetening purposes. So things like honey and maple syrup, I'm trying to think what else, and brown sugar, they're all similar in terms of they are still sugar. And ultimately what we do want to do is make sure that our little ones aren't getting huge amounts. It's not that they can't have any of this in their diet, but because, as I said at the start, the early years are really about setting up food preferences. So if little ones start to get used to having lots of sugar and lots of sweet foods in their diet, it's more likely that they're going to carry on that kind of trajectory and eat you know, higher sugar foods and want higher sugar foods as they get older. So for me, the early years, and especially weaning, is about exploring new foods, exploring new flavors and new tastes that they've actually never had before. And I think that is really, you know, that's a really, really important aspect of weaning, is getting children familiar with lots of flavours and taste and a variety in their diet. And if we're giving them lots in the way of sugar, actually that's going to have an impact, because we're born with a preference for sweet food. And babies are already going to like and readily accept sweet tastes. So if we're giving them lots of those, that's going to kind of enhance that, and it might impact how much they like and enjoy some of those other foods, like, you know, savoury tastes like broccoli, or home-cooked meals like lasagna, for example. So for me, it's more about getting them familiar with a variety and not allowing them to just hone in on that preference of having sweeter options.
Great. Okay. So if how do you encourage those variety in the children's diet? How do you say, if you've got a particularly fussy eater, how would you as a parent encourage children to try a variety of foods particularly?
Yes, I think that's a really good question, and that's something in my book, and I've massively tried to cover this. You know, I really feel like when it comes to weaning and when it comes to introducing solid food, that the more variety we get in from a young age, the more variety children will eat as they get older. And that's actually been shown in research. So the more variety we offer, you know, in that first year of weaning, for example, the more variety we those children will tend to eat as they get older. And that's really, really key. So exactly why, you know, throughout my whole book, it really is a big, big, big push about exploring, offering children lots of the kind of foods that we eat as adults, offering lots of tastes and flavors and adding in herbs and spices, and, you know, so many ways to try and get your little ones familiar with that variety. That's obviously what happens when you start at the weaning age. If you're going for children who are a little bit older, fussy eating is really normal, and most children go through some kind of phase at some point in their early years where they will be a bit more fussy with food. And the first thing I'd say is it's really normal. So for parents, try not to panic, try not to worry too much. Just realise that fussy eating is quite often a phase. Can be what we call fleeting, or it can be persistent, and often it's fleeting, but actually the way that we deal with it will often lead to it maybe be a little bit longer, you know, something that is a bit more prolonged, or something that just sort of comes and goes. Now my son is nearly 4, and he has been through so many phases, especially during lockdown, where he's been more fussy, where he's refused meals, where he's refused certain foods. It's part of the journey of feeding young children. And I think that for a lot of us as parents, we almost beat ourselves up about it, but actually acceptance of the fact that that's normal and that's okay should help to take some of that pressure off of us and of them, and that can make a really big difference. But ultimately it's about checking intakes, checking routine. Also it's about, you know, as parents, us role modeling, that can be really, really key. It's, you know, it's as I do, not as I say. So rather than, you know, us constantly saying, well, this is what I want you to eat, and us being somewhere else in the kitchen tidying up, or us eating something else that we don't have, trying to eat the same food with little ones can make a really big difference. And then just the more variety you offer, the more variety your little ones like to eat, even if they are picky, even if they say, I only want that and that. If you only offer that and that, that's all they're ever going to eat. So it's about exploring that wide variety, and that is really, really key.
So you mentioned that that your son had refused meals. Should parents worry if one evening their child just refuses to eat dinner?
Absolutely not. You know, children aren't going to starve themselves from missing one meal, just like you and I as adults. If we didn't have a meal, we would be a bit hungry, but we're not going to starve. You know, we'd be absolutely fine. It would possibly just mean that we're going to eat more the next day. Also, we have to remember, and this is something that is so key, and I try and encourage parents to think about, is that appetites go up and down all the time. You know, children's appetites are affected by so much. So whether it's too hot outside, whether it's too cold inside, whether it's they're distracted, whether they're feeling overwhelmed, whether they're feeling overtired, whether they've just grazed on food earlier on and aren't that hungry, whether they're distracted, whether they got toothache, whether they're feeling unwell. There's so many things that will impact their appetite. So it's really important to let them sort of lead that a little bit and follow their cues.
Yeah, absolutely. That's really helpful advice. Thank you. So I just want to talk a little bit about deficiencies. And iron and vitamin D are some common deficiencies in young children. So what are the signs parents should be looking out for? And is there anything that could help them up their children's intake of vitamin D and iron?
It's really difficult to say, because obviously, you know, ultimately with children, all we're really looking at is their growth and their length. And one thing I would say is with young children, it is important to try and get their growth and their length measured fairly regularly, you know, once every month, once every 2 months in young babies, for example. So you can go to your local health visitor. Hopefully that's going to start opening up a bit more now, and lots of parents will be able to do that a bit more regularly. But that's the best measure of how they're growing and developing. It's really, really hard to tell otherwise. Otherwise, you know, you're looking at things like, are they producing enough wet and dirty nappies during the day? Are they really lethargic? Are they, you know, falling asleep? Do they have lots of energy? Are they active? You're just looking for all of those kind of things to make sure that they are getting enough in the way of milk and solid food. And remember that with young babies, they will also be, you know, having a large proportion of their diet will be from formula or breast milk as well. And up until around about 10 months of age, that's going to be making up the majority of their diet. And then after that, it's more like solid foods will start to take over, hopefully, in terms of the amount of calories and nutrients. However, when it comes to some nutrients, so for example, iron is incredibly important for young children. And the reason for this is because mum's stores actually are passed on to baby during the third trimester, and also during birth as well. A lot of mum's iron stores are passed on to baby. And those iron stores start to deplete when baby gets to around 6 months of age, some a little bit earlier, some a little bit later. It actually depends very much on mum's stores, and also whether there was delayed cord clamping and birth and everything else. So there's lots of factors that can impact iron status. But the reason I'm talking about it is because actually during weaning, it's really important to start getting those iron-rich foods in. So around 6 months after baby's first taste, we want to start to be introducing iron-rich foods like lentils, beans, pulses, nut butters, meat, fish, eggs. These are all great sources of iron that you want to start including in baby's diet. And again, in my book, that's what I've massively done. There's a whole 30 step-by-step section in the book, and it basically hand-holds parents day by day through the weaning journey. And what I've made sure I've done is I've incorporated things like how to introduce iron, how to introduce allergens in during this time. So iron is incredibly important. Vitamin D is also recommended to be supplemented. So from birth, babies who are breastfed should be having an 8.5 to 10 microgram supplement of vitamin D. If babies are formula fed, they don't need to have this until they are having less than 500 mils of formula, and then they need 8.5 to 10 micrograms of vitamin D every day too.
Thank you. And could you just
Sorry, that was very long-winded.
No, that was brilliant. And I just wanted to touch on your book. I believe it's publishing in a couple of days. And perhaps, yes. Great. And perhaps you could share where people can find it and just a little bit about your book.
Yeah, amazing. So my book, the official publishing date is the 29th of April, but it's so interesting. Loads of people have been writing to me already saying that they've already received it. So my book is called How to Wean Your Baby. And I genuinely wrote this because I worked with Joe Wicks on his Wean in 15 campaign. And as I was doing it, I just realized, like, these parents have so many in-depth questions. I mean, there was kind of no question after about a year of doing it. There was no question that I didn't know the answer to, and I couldn't just sort of reel off the tongue for parents. So I just thought, I know that parents need a really detailed, evidence-based guide on how to wean their baby. And that's exactly how this was born. It's called How to Wean Your Baby because I said to the publishers, I want it to do exactly what it says on the tin. Like, this is a literal guide. So it's got an introduction, obviously, like a lot of the other weaning books have, goes over things like how much milk and also milestones for baby. Also goes over things like my general tips and how to introduce finger foods and what to do about different your baby. So it goes over all of that, but there's also a really unique section in the middle of the book which is called this, the first 30 days, and this section basically takes and handholds parents through the first 30 days of their baby's weaning journey with shopping lists, tips, recipes, everything they need to know for that first 30 days. It was so difficult to create because I had to try and take everyone's kind of thoughts into account. I had to make sure there was iron-rich foods, I had to make sure there was allergens, I had to make sure, you know, all of the kind of guidelines around introducing those foods were maintained. So it was a real struggle. But I think it's a really important part of the book. And for any parents who are unsure, who are nervous, who just want that little bit more hand-holding, this will absolutely do that for you. And then, sorry to go on, but there's also a next step section. So after that guide, we've got a whole what happens next, how do I balance my baby's meals out, how do I move on through textures. And then last but not least, in the back of the book, I have got all of my my recipes, and there's about 45 different recipes in the back of the book, breakfast, lunch and dinner, and most of them are perfect family meals, like for example this one, Greek meze, you know, falafels, and here's my red dragon pie. Like, lots of them are really great family recipes. So yeah, that's basically the book in a very large nutshell.
Brilliant, thank you. I think that's really important as well, if they're foods that the whole family can eat, because then you can get the baby involved. You mentioned in an article that you've just written for us, you can get them involved right from the get-go, and they can pick up those habits.
Completely, yeah.
One thing you did mention was about allergens, and a really common question we get is, when can you introduce things like peanuts to a baby's diet?
Yeah, so again, in the book, I actually have a step-by-step guide to introducing allergens. So it's separate to the whole 30 days. There's a whole guide on exactly how, because it's quite complicated. But what I would say is that there is a lot of research that's a lot more recent around introducing allergens. And although we used to talk about delaying them, we now talk about introducing those allergens early on in the diet, from around 6 months of age, to try and actually reduce the risk of allergies to these foods developing, because we now know that actually delaying introduction is what might be causing children to develop an allergy. Not always, because some children are going to have a food allergy anyway, no matter what you do. But actually introducing allergens early on in the weaning diet can reduce the risk of allergies developing. So things like peanuts, things like eggs, there are guidelines on how to introduce them, but they are recommended to be introduced from around 6 months of age.
Okay.
In small amounts, really small amounts initially.
Yeah. Everything in moderation. It's always key to follow, I think.
Yeah.
So perhaps we could just talk about some frequently asked questions that we get on Nutritionist Resource. And one of the ones that comes up a lot is, could you share any thoughts on baby-led weaning? Perhaps explaining what it is first, and then like, what are your thoughts on it?
Yeah, absolutely. So baby-led weaning is essentially the concept where you offer baby pieces of food and you allow them to feed themselves. You know, there's no spoon, there's no puree, you just give them pieces, maybe pieces of your own meal, or just chunks and pieces of food, and you just allow them to feed themselves. It's a concept that's really popular these days. I mean, America, they absolutely go wild for it, and most people in America seem to follow kind of baby-led weaning principles, and a lot of people here do in the UK, and that's great. And I think there's a lot of concepts of baby-led weaning that are really positive, like allowing baby to lead the journey and allowing them to feed themselves and stop when they're full, and encouraging self-feeding and encouraging them to eat similar foods to the rest of the family. So it can be really beneficial. However, there's no reason why, you know, a lot of baby-led weaning advocates will recommend you don't offer the spoon, you don't offer any purees. And I'm actually a bit of an advocate of saying there's no reason why you can't do both. You know, there's benefits to both. And again, a whole section in the book talks about this, and the fact that purees can still be beneficial. They can help to increase variety, they can build confidence, it can mean that your baby is experimenting with using a spoon as well. So there's lots of benefits to both. And I'm a bit of an advocate of just going with the flow. And also from my experience, my son loved food off of a spoon. My daughter does not like being fed off a spoon. She likes to feed herself. So there is also an element of allowing your baby to lead that journey and make that decision too. So I'm an advocate of the best of both approach, but whatever approach you take can work perfectly well.
Yeah. Absolutely. And our final question is, if a baby is being brought up on a vegan, plant-based diet, how do you ensure that they get the nutrients that they need to grow? Perhaps if they're not allergic, and it's not for a health reasons, how do you ensure that a child gets those nutrients on that diet?
Yeah, so do you know what? I'm seeing so many more plant-based families, plant-based weaning, and I think it can absolutely be done fine as long as it is, as long as you're just doing a little bit extra planning. Basically, that's what you need. You need to be aware of the nutrients that are needed. You need to be aware of making sure that you're planning that diet as well for little ones. So, for example, there are just some nutrients that you need to be a little bit more cautious of, and these are things like iron, because actually iron, there are plenty of iron-rich plant-based foods, but they're less readily absorbed. So you might want to offer them more regularly, and also it's a good idea to offer them alongside vitamin C-rich foods like fruits and vegetables. And also things like iodine. Iodine is largely found in seafood and dairy, so if your little one doesn't eat that, you might need to consider a supplement or fortified foods. Also omega-3, and that's found in fish and oily fish mainly. So again, if your little one doesn't eat fish, there are plant-based sources like flax seeds, rapeseed oil. Again, you need to make sure that you're including plenty of that in the diet. Also things like zinc and calcium are two other nutrients that you might want to be aware of. And again, it's really easy to get them on a plant-based diet, but sometimes they are less well absorbed and you might need to include more of those in the diet. So really, it's just being aware of nutrients that you need to make sure you're replacing if you're not having plant-based foods, and making sure that you're encouraging more of those. Always worthwhile talking to a healthcare professional, registered nutritionist or registered dietitian, for example, who might be able to give you information on exactly how to get those nutrients if your little one is struggling. So hopefully that'll help.
Absolutely, and that leads me on to my final question. So if a new parent is looking for some support, how does working with a professional support that, and what should they be looking out for when they're trying to find a nutrition professional?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. I think it depends. I mean, there's so many great professions and professionals out there. I think it's really important to have someone who, if we're talking about child nutrition, lots of people talk about child nutrition. Lots of people have, fantastic recipes, dairy-free Instagram pages, so much useful resources for parents. And I'm a massive advocate of that. And I think it's great. I think if you're getting advice, it's really important to make sure that the people you're getting advice from, that A, they're qualified, B, they've studied this topic and they know what they're talking about, C, they've had practical experience working with families. I've been working with families from the start of my career, in the NHS and healthcare settings, working alongside health visiting team. The other thing is that they're sort of multidisciplinary, so they know how, if they need to, they can refer to different areas. So if I'm working with a mum and I know that little one's having actually developmental problems with their mouth, they're not able to swallow foods, I know where I would refer that mum. So that kind of thing. And as I said, just experience and education and a sort of registered qualified professionals in the field that they're talking about. It's really difficult to say because, as I said, there's so many different professions, but definitely I would be making sure, checking out the credentials and the qualifications of whoever you're chatting to, and know that they're experienced in child and infant nutrition.
Yeah. So brilliant. So could you just share how people could find you if they want to reach out to you?
Yes, absolutely. So my book, which is out on Thursday. Sorry, I'm so loving actually having it in my hands.
Absolutely.
It's been a labour of love. But so my book is available. You can buy it basically most places. So Amazon, obviously, it's available. WH Smith, Waterstones, Wordery, Book Depository. So all of those different places, and also local bookshops. I've been trying to encourage lots of sort of local purchasing of it as well. So you can go to local bookshops and ask them, and they can get a few copies in. I've been doing that in some of my local areas. So if you're more wanting to buy local, then that's a really good option too. If you're looking for me, my website is www.srnutrition.co.uk. It's srnutrition.co.uk. And if you go to there is so much information on feeding baby. And then the last thing that's probably a useful place to send you to is at @sr_nutrition, which is my Instagram page. And again, huge amounts of resources on there as well. So check those out.
Great, thank you. I did also see your carrot cake porridge, and it made me, even at lunchtime, it made me very excited to try that. So
amazing. It's one of my most popular recipes, I have to say. And I've got one in the book, which is an ultimate carrot cake porridge as well.
I need that. Definitely. Well, thank you so much for joining me, Charlotte. It's been really great to chat to you.
No worries. Thank you. It was really, really nice chatting. Thanks for having me on.
Thank you, and we'll speak to you soon.